Grassroots efforts to allow a comeback for rent control in Boston recently came together at the State House. That's where a hearing took place on legislation that would allow cities and towns in Massachusetts to adopt rent control and other housing measures, an option that was taken off the table in a statewide referendum 25 years ago. To talk about the legislation and what it might accomplish is one of the sponsors, the state representative for parts of Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, and Rosendale, Nika Elugardo. Thank you very much for being with us, Representative.
Thanks for having me back.
Representative, I'm glad to have you on again, and I wonder how much of this reflects just what you pick up in the neighborhoods you serve, what people are telling you, why we at least need this option.
Right, well, the housing crisis is massive and we need all hands on deck, and one of the things we need to do is stop the rapid rise of rents so that people aren't, it's not just about eviction, it's also about not being able to afford food and health care, and so we need to make sure that the market expands a little bit more slowly than it has been, and rent control could help with that.
Now, I know recently when the mayor gave his speech, he talked about problems with the market, he talked about remedies. There wasn't anything about rent control, and I know you're not maybe signed on to a given form of rent control here, but
Sure.
Why does the city need this option?
Well, we're not talking about your grandfather's rent control, so to speak. We don't want to recreate the problems of the 80s, and that's why this bill is structured as a local option. And it allows rent control to be implemented in specific zones for a temporary time period or long-term anti-displacement zones that might be identified based on being particularly burdened by the crisis, or to not take it up at all. Actually, I heard the mayor on Jim Brody the other day, and he said, while he can't advocate for any particular form of rent control, he does support our bill because it's a local options bill. And the more options we give our municipalities, the better for them, the more power they have. And we had a number of municipal leaders come out and talk about that in the hearing a couple days ago.
One thing I suspect about this push, and it's mainly a grassroots push for rent control, is that it may encourage other people to do other things to help with housing.
Sure.
Do you think that's been happening?
Oh, definitely. My co-sponsor, Mike Connolly, and I'm so grateful for his leadership on this because, I'm new to the legislature and I have another big housing bill that I've really been focused on related to public housing. And, it's really important to both of us to mobilize the pre-existing energy, but also to expand the energy on the ground, not just around rent control, but around a more comprehensive approach to housing first and making sure that everyone is housed. And rent control doesn't solve the problem of affordable housing. It doesn't make rents cheaper. It doesn't protect or expand the availability or the supply of affordable housing, but it does create a symbolic far end where it says, look, this is an indicator that things are out of control, addressing the bleeding of a too rapidly expanding market, which also affects homeowners who can't afford rising property taxes, especially elder homeowners. That's one end of the problem, but the other end we also need to attend to, and a lot of people are coming alive to that reality because of their activation around rent control. One
of the things I noticed about this bill that we did not have 25 years ago is that there are zones where you could have more, I guess, a higher form of regulation.
Right.
Why was that put in there?
Well, the bill has a lot of options, and then municipalities, towns, and cities can take it further. So there's the option to regulate upfront costs. There are various tenant protections on the eviction side, just cause eviction, for example. And we wanted to expand the toolkit as much as possible and to make it clear to towns and municipalities that if you had problems with rent control in the past, you have the tools here to mitigate those problems or maybe to even create new benefits, to have a more targeted form of rent control that really addresses problems without creating as many unintended consequences.
One of the more perplexing things for me around rent control debate is that oftentimes we see renters being displaced from buildings where the rents have been fairly low for a long time and where the buildings have been, neglected. They need a lot of work and that costs a lot of money.
Right.
What do you think is the best way to come at a situation like that?
Well, it's important to work with the whole system and to not only be focused on the tenants, but really working closely with property owners. One of the things I've learned through the advocacy process here, because we hear from all sides of the issues, is that there's a distinction between neglectful landowners and landowners that want to do the right thing and lack the resources. And so we're trying to make sure that the protections we offer in law and in local legislation make it possible for the landowners that want to do a good job to do that and to not be penalized utilized. And so the ability to make exceptions for those who need help from the city or who need help from the state, who might be either small property owners or large property owners whose the cost of development is just so high. So one of the other bills I have make it easier for developers, for example, who might be smaller, to go into partnership with the city and to renovate low-income and affordable housing, or to create new low-income and affordable housing. So we can't just look at tenants; we have to look at the whole system.
As usual, we're hearing from some of the property owner side that this will discourage housing supply. There are also signs that not as many people are trying to get building permits to develop things. Right. Do you worry about that at all?
If this were the only thing we were doing, it would be a mistake. And so it's really important that we advocate for the bills that are moving through that will increase supply, that will make a zoning reform easier, especially as an option for local towns and municipalities, that will create access to state surplus land that's currently not being tapped properly. I had a BU just down the street, a BU class in the data science program. We gave them all the data, and the governor's administration was really helpful, giving us access to databases to determine what is the low end of the value of the surplus land that could be used for affordable housing purposes, not just for building, but for generating revenue and capital for affordable housing. And it's upwards of $1.2 billion in value. And that's a very, very conservative estimate based on limited data that we have. And so we really need all hands on deck so that we're creating many opportunities to make development easier, while we're also on the other end saying, like, look, we can't let the market explode out of control. You can still double someone's rent in 10 years, but you just can't double it in 3 or 5 years, because that's creating a lot of problems for the state and, of course, for our residents.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with State Representative Nika Elugardo. Representative, you've talked about, with your legislation, even just rethinking the nature and the mission of public housing. What would that mean? Or what could it mean?
Well, we need to look at public housing as an investment in public property, and the stewards of that investment are the people living in public housing. So, for example, I have public housing tenants in my district who have been in public housing for going on now their 5th generation, where their kids, their grandkids, their great-grandkids are now getting older and having children. And on their watch, that land has become some of the most valuable land in the country, but they're still worried about getting kicked out. We need to treat them as investors and give them opportunities to invest in the land financially. And so they need the assets to do that. And the government has those assets. And so, I don't know if we have time to talk about it today, but I really like geeking out on the possibility of engaging more people in utilizing the surplus land in the state for the purposes of affordable housing. We have what we need to solve the problem, but we need to let go of the old model. Federal housing models really developed our concept of public housing. We need a more localized, state-based and municipal-based understanding of what we want it to look like to invest in housing that everyone can afford. And that requires a complete rethinking of how we think of tenancy, how we think of public ownership differently than private ownership, and how we think of public markets differently than we think of private markets. We need both, but we can't think of them in the same way.
And of course, what about connections to other things? I mean, how that housing fits into education, community services. I guess that has to be part of it too, doesn't it? Right.
A lot of our viewers and listeners will be aware of the fact that housing is what they call a social indicator of health. So is transportation and transit, and the access of transit, like the closeness of it to your housing, has to do with everything from whether you can get to a job, which is tied to stress-related illnesses, to whether you can actually get to your healthcare provider. Housing is something like that. Not only does having adequate housing increase your health, but if you lose your housing or are stressed about losing your housing, it decreases your health. So it creates a negative cycle or a positive cycle. And not to say that the justice elements of that story are primary and important, but there's also an economic element to that story. So when people don't have housing, and it affects job access, and it affects their kids' ability to get to school, and it affects where they can go to school and what kinds of schools they can have, and property taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, That's a huge cost burden on the state. So the money that we save long term for making sure that everyone's housed, educated, and has adequate health care is well worth whatever we put up front to make that happen.
I want to ask you about a trip you made last year to Central America. Here stateside, we look at immigration as either national security or human rights. You went upstream to look at what's going on down there. What did you learn from that?
Sure. We went to Honduras and El Salvador, which are two very different countries that both have the same problem. Massive numbers of people, record numbers of people are fleeing the country. In Honduras in particular, I learned, because we talked to over 200 activists on the ground from the right and from the far right and the far left and everywhere in the middle. There really is a narco dictatorship there. What that means is that the narcotics industry has infiltrated every level of government. That means courts, that means prosecutors, that means defenders, that means the legislature, and that means the presidency. And so there's nowhere that people feel safe institutionally. And that breakdown in institutional integrity and justice, the U.S. has had a role in that history, because sometimes we've thought in the past that we're choosing the lesser of two evils by choosing folks that are involved in narcotics but maybe don't have political ties to some of the countries that we were worried about during the Cold War. And we used to use countries like Honduras as a proxy, as a Cold War proxy for us on our behalf. And we had some pretty bad bed partners. And leaders like Senator Ed Markey were yelling about that back then, but he was one of the lone voices in Congress that was saying, look, we're creating problems in the future. Those problems are coming to pass, and it's resulting in massive amounts of immigration. And then the hard line, beyond the hard line that we've been taking for a decade or more, and then President Trump has exacerbated that with whatever he calls I wouldn't call it immigration policy, but whatever he's doing now has further exacerbated the problem that we helped to cause. And so I just wanted to learn more about what that looks like on the ground and to see what we can do in the United States as everyday citizens, as state legislators, to support leaders like Ed Markey, and now it's a much broader group of legislators who are willing to encourage everyday Americans indefinitely to take responsibility as legislators at the federal level for our part in geopolitical dynamics and how we can help them or hurt them.
Now, in this part of the world, climate change also seems to be driving the problem as well. What should we be doing about that?
Right, and that's interesting, just as a little segue from what I was just talking about. There are huge climate change impacts on having narco dictators run coastal lands, for example. And we can talk about that on another day, but I'd love for listeners to call me up and talk to me about that at the office. Yeah, but I think Massachusetts has always kind of led on climate change, but we need to really lead. And so we think about our nation falling behind the international guidelines to get to fully renewable energy by 2050 or even 2035. Well, Massachusetts has to do it faster because we have to lead out ahead of the curve. And so that means we can't just think about adapting and dealing with the extreme weather conditions, but we have to do that as a community that's looking out for our vulnerable populations, elders, people living in low-income communities where they can't move or they can't make the adjustments. We also have to innovate. We also have to rehabilitate. There are things we can do to help the climate heal. We need to learn more about that, but primarily we have to use less, because even if we move to fully renewable energy and we use more energy, we're going to find ourselves in the same problem. There's a whole culture shift. That's why I've been blue biking all the time. Well, I didn't blue bike here today in my fancy skirt, but I've been trying to get, my goal last year was to get 100 blue bike rides in 6 months that would have been car rides between meetings. And so I met that goal barely, 102. And so now I'm going to try to do 100 bike rides a quarter. Little things like that everyone can do in addition to the policy that we've got to increase our renewables and to fix up our buildings.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
State Representative Nika Elugardo.
Nice
We'll have more news in just a moment.